My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
The need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing
Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. In this episode, part 3 of our conversation on trade, we'll catch back up with Carolyn Brehm and Francine Lamoriello to hear their thoughts on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has affected trade. They discussed the way that the invasion has slowed down the post-COVID economic recovery, how it may be speeding up the decoupling of trade, and what it all means for the longer-term outlook for globalization. We also revisited our conversation on issues surrounding trade and human rights. Let's listen to what Carolyn had to say. All right, so Carolyn, welcome back. And so since we spoke last, a lot has happened. And I just wanted to get your update and your take on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to affect trade in, the near term, medium term, long term. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Kelly. It certainly seems like the world has done a 180-degree flip since we all talked about trade on February 14th. Setting aside the horrific situation, the destruction and death, and the millions of Ukrainians that have been forced from their homes and have fled to neighboring countries without any end in sight. This does feel, in some respects, like the beginning of what could be World War III. And here's hoping that the negotiations that are taking place off and on will actually come to a resolution, and we'll see peace again. But focusing on the impacts on trade policy, I think it's interesting that in our conversation back in February, we talked about the big stresses that in globalization that have resulted from the things that have happened in the last decade or more, the economic fallout from 2008 and 9, the Trump years and the trade wars that ensued during that period, Brexit, the fallout from the pandemic. Those were all things that created stresses and strains on trade policy, but that it feels like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the rapid response of Western countries, remarkably rapid response, I would say, both Europe and the United States, with invoking sanctions and escalating sanctions, have created, I think, a real split in the global economy between what could be evolving into a U.S.-led and China-led world. What we're seeing is that global companies in particular, which is the focus that I always look at these things from, their investment and trade patterns were formed in the 1990s and the early 21st century. And what we're seeing now is that those patterns have been extremely challenged by increased tariffs, the supply chain disruptions, more stringent export controls, and the increased use of sanctions. And even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. has reached for sanctions both at the executive branch level and Congress, increasingly in response to foreign policy and national security concerns. And then we've seen this steady sort of embracing by many countries of a more nationalistic trade and economic policies that favor their domestic constituencies. So, what we've seen with Western companies, American companies reacting in response to the invasion and sanctions has been a lot of, outright sale of their businesses or putting them on pause, pulling back investments, exiting their personnel. The businesses that seem to have stayed in place have defended their presence because they are serving consumers or other humanitarian needs, whether it be food, daily use products, medicines, etc. And frankly, I mean, Russia has never been a big market for a lot of U.S. companies. It's not as significant as, say, China is. But it is certainly important for some sectors, without a doubt, energy, commodities. And we're seeing that in the stresses and the shortages and the inflationary pricing for items like aluminum, titanium. And I will see even more pressures on the cost of energy, I think, going forward, and agricultural products, given the fact that both Russia and Ukraine are such important breadbaskets for many, many countries in the world, particularly Central Asia, Egypt, Turkey, and even China. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of pressures building there, and the potential for accelerated conflict in some of these countries if inflation and food shortages get out of hand. I would say one of the biggest unknowns right now in my mind is, what is China up to in their in their support for Russia, or at least their unwillingness to condemn Russia for its invasion. And I think this raises the political risks even further for companies that are doing business both in Russia and in China, particularly Western investors. I mean, companies, I think, were already looking at ways to segregate their businesses in some of these risky markets, and basically serving the domestic market with domestic inputs, domestic manufacturing capability, and looking at ways to streamline and or resource products that might be more difficult to get. And this was even before the invasion, but I think now it is clearly having to happen in particularly in the companies that are doing risk mitigation for what the next 6 months, year, and 5 years ahead might look like. And the other big factor is that in this period, particularly in the United States, since Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, companies have really doubled down on their expressed values when it comes to environment, social, and governance issues. And so multinationals, particularly American ones, all have these statements of purpose and these statements of principles about relating their business purpose to ethics. These statements are all going to be under scrutiny, even in a greater sense, as companies try to defend their continued engagement with markets like Russia, and perhaps with China. And one of the things that I think people are watching is whether the Chinese are somehow going to be facilitating Russian sidestepping global sanctions and helping them continue to trade. And that will become another point of conflict, I think, between Russia and the West and China and the West. And it will also be a dangerous moment, I think, as increasing criticism comes from places in the U.S. Congress, both the Democrats and the Republicans and the executive branch, who are, looking for ways to get even tougher on China than is already the case, which means an even further devolving situation when it comes to U.S.-China relations, which are already in the dumpster. So I think companies have to be very careful as they operate in this very tricky space and decide, it's an environment of good versus evil. And there's going to be some tough choices, I believe, for some in whether that they stay or go. And not just in Russia, but also in markets like China going forward. One other word I'd like to say about building on a conversation that we had back in mid-February on U.S. trade policy during the Biden administration. I think we see even more clearly now with this latest crisis that the U.S. political system in regards to trade is badly broken, and it does not feel that there is a way forward with the current Congress and the executive branch in seeking any market access or trade liberalization measures outside of what existed on the books for years. And the WTO and the G20 have been overwhelmed by geopolitical tensions. And I think what is so worrisome for some is that there's just doesn't seem to be a lot of workable global mechanisms to help deal with the next big economic threat to the world, like another 2008, 2009 economic meltdown or another pandemic, because we don't seem to have the multilateral platforms that are operating in a way that can bring countries closer together to, despite all of the differences, work out better ways to resolve some of these looming issues.
In many ways, it's like sped up a lot of what was already happening with the COVID and all that kind of stuff, and then also because of where it's happening, it's speeding things up, but then it's exacerbating supply chain issues because of like the gas exports and the prices for oil and stuff now, and for transport fuel. But then also you throw in the food crisis. The ethics stuff is really interesting and ties back to what we talked about in the first part. But it's going to be interesting too, because you said they have really tough decisions, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Because in Russia, it's technically an easier decision for companies, right? Because A, it's a smaller market, like you said, and B, they're literally committing genocide in a ongoing war that's on the front page of the paper and the news every day. Now, China, it's more difficult because a much larger market, and yes, they are committing, for all intents and purposes, genocide with the Uyghurs, but it's not front and center in everybody's face every day. So it's so anyways, it'll be interesting because they're not. I mean, technically, genocide is genocide, and you should do that. But when you look at those two things on paper, it becomes probably, as a business leader, a much harder decision on what you do in terms of China, at least. So,
For sure. But at some point, stakeholders and shareholders, and I think employees, are going to be asking these questions in a way that they haven't yet. And I'm thinking about that remarkable piece that was just in one of the major newspapers a couple days ago about the family. Actually, they were Uzbek, that had been the father had been imprisoned. They released him, and then they smuggled the family out, and they're now telling their story. Um, and how many more of those kinds of stories do we need before more people start asking questions about why are we enabling this terrible regime in Beijing? But I'm not a Pollyanna. I realize, China represents a huge, huge market for many, many companies, and their top first or second market in the world. Very different set of calculations that need to be made.
yeah, I'm glad I'm not I mean, in my heart, I want to do one thing. In my mind, though, if I'm a CEO or CFO for a company, it's a much more difficult conversation. And as we've seen with like the NBA and even Hollywood has under the wire spent the last 25 years not doing or saying anything bad about China. So yeah, it's going to be tough. But anyways, well, thank you very much. Here's Francine's take on the situation.
Well, I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is already having an enormous impact on the global economy and on trade, resulting from the war itself and from the sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S., EU, other allied countries. And these are really unprecedented. I think we've all heard a lot about that. The United Nations, WTO, I think the IMF have already lowered forecasts for trade. I think the WTO has halved its expectation for trade for 2022. So the invasion, the war in Ukraine is absolutely slowing down the recovery of global trade that we had hoped for and expected following the COVID-19 pandemic. But I believe it's going to have very consequential effects on trade, investment, global supply chains, and perhaps even how we look at globalization itself over the longer term. So, one of the most obvious and maybe most dramatic impacts so far has been the cutoff in the supply of fuel and agricultural commodities, grains, oils, fertilizers. That's already leading to higher prices and threatening food security in countries in Africa, Middle East, Turkey, and elsewhere. And so we have to really be concerned about increased hunger, possible civil unrest, and the instability that all of that could cause in those regions. And important trade routes have been closed off. I mean, in the Black Sea, apparently, we've got backups of tankers and other ships. There's an inability to fly over Russian and Ukrainian airspace. So there's already a disruption in the movement of goods, a lot of bottlenecks and higher costs. And again, this is raising prices and leading to delays. And I think, for the longer term business strategy, the war in Ukraine has highlighted the importance of diversifying supply chains. I mean, this, I believe, was already underway. We've seen this already as a result of the COVID pandemic. But I think more fundamental, longer term impacts is what we're going to see on how companies make global business decisions, and that these are more than purely commercial calculations. We've seen for some time in polling that citizens around the world increasingly are looking to the business sector, to business leaders, to demonstrate commitment to solving wider problems of society and to take moral stance. And we can see how many global companies have pulled out of Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. I think this would have taken place even without the sanctions. And even when this conflict ends, how will Russia be viewed as a viable partner for trade and investment? I think this is highly questionable. One area I've given some thought to is that perhaps there's reason to hope that the increased cooperation and solidarity of the United States and our allies in responding to the Russian invasion could carry over to other areas, such as in agreeing to new trade mechanisms. Maybe these will be smaller or more specific trade agreements among like-minded countries, not trying to do things through the WTO. We've already seen the Biden administration pursuing some of these initiatives regionally. We might see other initiatives to strengthen economic and commercial ties, again, with our allies, our natural allies, with whom we share ideology and political systems. Uh, Janet Yellen has spoken of friend shoring. I don't know if she made that term up, but friend shoring, I think, could really very well be the way forward as companies look to diversify their supply chain, but also to maintain relationships and partnerships with in other countries. But I think what all of this is going to do is raise real questions about the future of the rules based global trading system that we've had in place since World War II. And what sorts of new strategies will the United States and our trading partners have to employ to assure that this system benefits us as a country, but also serves to promote the ideals that we as democratic based countries really wish to support.
So I do have a quick follow up on sort of the appetite within the U.S. For the type of trade deals you mentioned in your estimation. I mean, the last couple presidential elections has shown that there's been a movement away from trade and trade deals in the public's mind, and even some on the Democratic side who backed things like TTP then had to backtrack on that. So do you think that there's been a shift or enough of a shift domestically in the U.S. because of what's going on with COVID, because of supply chain issues, because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, to maybe make it more readily acceptable to American voters to be able to go ahead with these types of trade deals?
Well, I think it's going to be really challenging. I think, in fact, in a way, COVID, what's happening in Russia, is perhaps highlighting the need in some minds to, in short, to bring everything back to the United States. Highlighted the fact that we aren't actually manufacturing at least enough of critical things, and that's where I mean, you're looking at the work on Capitol Hill, on the infrastructure bill, on the support for semiconductor industry and others. I think no, there's in fact a real sense, and the administration, came in with this that we have to first beef up and strengthen of the American manufacturing base in order, in fact, to be able to then take our place in global trade agreements. But that being said, I think practically speaking, there really will be a need to maintain international business relationships and the kinds of trade agreements over new and emerging issues, privatization, digital privacy, and so on, where we have to be able to respond. I don't think companies are pulling back from participating in global markets, but there'll need to be some rules around some of those issues. And so all I'm saying is there might be more willingness to try to negotiate these and to see what progress can be made in trade among like-minded countries, rather than to keep pursuing perhaps through global trade initiatives. And again, this has been the Biden administration's strategy so far. But I think the war in Ukraine perhaps maybe lends more support from other countries for this kind of an approach. And, we have to look at whether the global rules-based global trading system is going to be able to support the future. I think that it was already clear that many changes need to be made in order to have the continued participation and by the United States, but also by other countries around the world. And so I think I see this as the only I think, the only way in which we can make progress right now going forward.
Yeah, and history shows that most of the times when you see a change in the global trading system on a massive scale or international order, there's always a shock to the system that sort of spurs that on, and maybe this is the shock to the system.
Absolutely, this could be the shock to the system.
That was part 3 of our look at trade, technology, and China. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. This episode was produced by Aaron Jones. Until we meet again.